There are moments in a life when something shifts. It's not always sudden. More often it happens so gradually you only catch it in hindsight. A change you notice only once it's already done. Thoughts move. Old certainties loosen their grip. The way you understand yourself and the people around you and your own small place in the world, all of it quietly rearranges. And somewhere along the way, through struggle or loss, or simply the passing of enough time, you come to realize that the change you'd been waiting for was never a destination at all. It was a path. And everyone, whether they know it or not, is walking it. Welcome to the Wayseeker's Path. This is a series about healing and transformation, about the stories we tell ourselves, and the stories that help us become something new. Using the timeless mythology of Star Wars as our shared language, we'll explore mental health, personal growth, spirituality, identity, resilience, and what it asks of us to move through that strange, deeply human process of becoming more fully ourselves. The Wayseeker's Path includes personal stories about mental health. We're not doctors, therapists, or licensed professionals. Psychedelic therapies include controlled substances under federal law and are available only through regulated programs in a small number of states. We are not encouraging the use of these outside those legal channels. If something here speaks to you, take it to someone qualified, your doctor, your therapist, someone who knows your history. And if you're struggling right now, please reach out to a professional or a crisis line in your area. For as long as I can remember, I've been hypervigilant. I didn't have the word for it when I was a kid, but as an adult, I recognized that I was always scanning, always anticipating, always running projections 3 steps ahead or planning for the next crisis. And for most of my life, I simply took that to be who I was. Then came COVID. I know I'm not alone in saying that the world changed under those years. But that change set something off in me, a kind of alarm, low and constant, and I wouldn't recognize it for what it was until much later. What I do remember is how tethered I became to the endless stream of social media and the news cycle. And not once in all of it did I stop to ask myself whether consuming information in this way was even good for me. I told myself a different story, that the scrolling made me a responsible citizen, that constant attention meant I was honoring what mattered. Never mind that what mattered seemed to be changing by the hour. What I couldn't see was that I was feeding a part of myself that had already been running hot for years. Because of the way my mind is wired, I spend an enormous amount of energy simply holding myself at equilibrium. My system takes in more than it needs to, more signal, more detail, more of everything. And it rarely gets a chance to rest. For someone built like that, doom scrolling and around-the-clock news weren't just harmless habits, they were dangerous terrain. I was living in a near constant state of alertness and existential dread. And eventually, I hit a wall. I reached a point where I understood with real clarity that I couldn't keep meeting the world this way. So I stepped back. Social media first. I'd taken breaks before. Everybody takes breaks. But this was different. And the difference is what mattered. This time, I wasn't pausing. I was done. And right away, I felt it. Lighter, calmer, more balanced than I'd been in ages. But I made one crucial mistake. I let the 24-hour political news rush in to fill the space that social media left. It wasn't long before I was right back inside the exhaustion. Except now, it was worse. Now, it had a temperature. I was angry, in a seething, helpless sort of way, permanently on edge, and I was hard to live with. The meltdowns came more often, over work stress, over setbacks, old family wounds that had never fully healed. And again, it fell to my husband to help put me back together. And still, it escalated. The worst of it was what began to go gray. One by one, things that had always grounded me lost their color. Walking on the beach, playing with the dogs, being out in nature, my art, my writing. The simple joys stopped registering. Gray became my baseline. That frightened me. So I did the responsible thing. I sought out psychiatric help. And I started on a mild antidepressant. I'd done everything else I knew how to do, and when none of it had been enough, medication was the only door that I had not yet tried. And honestly, it helped. It steadied my mood. My baseline lifted back towards something I could recognize. And for the first time in a long while, I felt a bit more like myself again. A long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away, in an age the Jedi would one day look back upon as one of harmony, exploration, and light, there lived a Jedi Knight named Caelum Voxx. For nearly 2 decades, Caelum had done everything the Order had asked of him. He had studied, served, meditated in accordance with traditions passed down through generations of Jedi who understood that true balance came not through mastery of the moment, but mastery of the self. Caelum Voxx was the ideal Jedi. He was disciplined, focused, centered, or at least that's how it appeared to others. Each morning before the great temple had fully stirred to life, Caelum would enter the nearby woods and sit in silence. As morning sun lit the gold leaves of the forest canopy, he breathed steadily. His awareness softened. He opened himself fully to the living force that connected all things. Gentle grazing animals would stop their feeding long enough to regard him with curiosity. He knew them well. With my mood leveled out, I felt steady enough to try something I'd been meaning to for years and had never made the time for: meditation. And like a lot of people, I was bad at it. I couldn't get my mind to go quiet, or worse, I'd drift off to sleep. Those first few attempts felt like failures, and they failed for a familiar reason. I'd misunderstood what meditation even was. I thought the whole point of it was to silence the mind, to stop thinking, to master my focus, and to make the noise stop. Then I came across a talk by a Tibetan monk, and one thing he said rearranged the entire picture for me. Meditation, he explained, isn't about eliminating thought at all. It's about learning to be present, about noticing the moment your mind has wandered off and then gently, without judgment, bringing it back again and again and again, as many times as necessary. That returning, that small, patient act of coming back, that was meditation. The return. So I tried it that way, and it worked. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I'd found something that actually helped me to slow down, not to fix myself, not to solve anything, just to move through the day a little more slowly. And yet, something underneath still felt unresolved. I've always been intuitive, but this was something I couldn't pinpoint. Maybe meditation was simply what finally made me quiet enough to feel it, even if I couldn't source it. Because on paper, I'd assembled all the right tools. I'd cut down the static, changed the way I ate, moved my body more. I was on medication that worked. And still, there was this stubborn sense that whatever my mind had figured out, My body hadn't quite gotten the memo. It was as if years of stress and anxiety were stored somewhere deep, still holding on. And no amount of affirmation or clear thinking or steady breathing seemed able to reach all the way down to them. There's a book that finally named the thing that I couldn't. The Body Keeps the Score by the psychiatrist Bessel van der Kolk. Quote, traumatized people chronically feel unsafe inside their bodies. The past is alive in the form of gnawing interior discomfort. Their bodies are constantly bombarded by visceral warning signs, and in an attempt to control these processes, they often become expert at ignoring their gut feelings and in numbing awareness of what is played out inside. They learn to hide from themselves. I knew that feeling well. I knew it from the inside. I'd gotten pretty good at tucking away the parts of me that were struggling and presenting a steadier self to the world. In other words, good at surviving my life. But surviving life had quietly cost me the living of it. And what worried me most were the qualities that were slipping away from me. Wonder, mystery, connection. Once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. Something inside was insisting on change, something deep. And that was the moment I started searching for a different path. For years, meditation had been Caelum Voxx's anchor, the quiet place he returned to when the noise of the galaxy became too much. But in recent months, his thoughts were troubled. The Force itself, once experienced as harmony, now felt strangely incomplete, like a melody with one discordant note. Not absent, the Force was never absent, but now it felt fractured somehow, as though something inside him had drifted out of alignment. And what troubled him most was that he could not understand why. Caelum had been the model Padawan, followed every teaching of his master, trusted the disciplines and passed the tests to become a knight. But with time, the quiet dissonance grew harder to ignore, and his inner landscape suddenly felt unfamiliar. Caelum was struck by a frightening possibility. What if mastery was not the same as wholeness? What if balance could be lost not through attachment or self-interest, not from giving in to anger or hate, but it could be lost a bit each day without even knowing it, until one day, balance and the light with it was gone for good. As my meditations deepened and I kept reading and listening to people who studied consciousness and trauma and the strange traffic between the mind and the body, one subject kept surfacing at the edges of the conversation: psychedelics. Not as party drugs, but as tools. Things being studied carefully by neuroscientists, psychiatrists, and therapists. For as long as I could remember, psychedelics lived on the same shelf in my mind where they probably live for a lot of people my age, as dangerous drugs to be avoided. They populated the anti-drug assemblies of my childhood, the after-school specials, the Just Say No campaigns of the 1980s. And I never once questioned any of it because I never had any reason to. But my own mental health had led me here, right to the edge of this subject. And the more I learned about how these compounds were actually being used in modern medicine, the more something began to shift. I remember the exact moment I stopped and thought, wait, have I been wrong about psychedelics this entire time? Long before laboratories or brain scans, many indigenous cultures had worked with these plant medicines for centuries, and in some cases, thousands of years, not as escape, not as recreation, but as something woven into ceremony, into healing, into spiritual and communal life, always under the guidance of experienced healers. That history alone was enough to make me stop and reconsider. In the 20th century, Western scientists finally turned their attention to these substances and began studying what they might offer medicine. But just as that research was building momentum, psychedelics spilled out into the cultural upheaval of the 1960s. Tangled up with counterculture and anti establishment politics, and voices urging a generation to turn on, tune in, and drop out, psychedelics stopped being research subjects and became political lightning rods. Restrictions tightened, public fear spread, the science all but ground to a halt, and for decades on, psychedelics were defined not by evidence, but by mythology. What fascinated me most was realizing that the psychedelic renaissance happening now wasn't a return to the 60s at all. In a lot of ways, it was a reaction against them. Leading researchers aren't asking anyone to reject society or chase enlightenment for its own sake. They're asking careful, rigorous, and unglamorous questions about depression, about PTSD, about addiction and anxiety and trauma, about the distress people face at the end of life. The whole center of gravity had moved from counterculture to clinical care, from ideology to evidence, from people experimenting on themselves to carefully designed therapeutic settings. And that, more than anything, explained why I was suddenly hearing serious universities and hospitals and physicians discussing something the culture had once written off entirely. The deeper I went, the more the picture opened up. There wasn't one psychedelic therapy, there were several. Different substances, each with its own character, its own uses, its own limits, and legal standing. Ketamine was already in use in clinics across the country, mostly for depression that hadn't responded to anything else. MDMA assisted therapy was showing real promise for PTSD, though it was still bound to clinical trials and the long road of regulatory approval. And psilocybin, the compound found in certain mushrooms, was producing some of the most striking research I'd ever encountered for depression, anxiety, for addiction, for the fear that arrives at the end of life, and for something researchers kept calling psychological flexibility. Each substance I came to understand had its own personality, its own niche, its own risks. And that was another surprise. The people I'd come to respect most in this field never once described these medicines as miracle cures. If anything, they were scrupulous about the limits. They talked about screening, about preparation, about set and setting, about the integration work that had to happen afterwards. They were honest that the experiences could be difficult, emotionally demanding, sometimes harrowing. They weren't selling magic, they were describing a process, one that asked real work of you before, during, and after. I learned that this treatment isn't for everyone, that certain conditions and certain family histories can make these medicines genuinely dangerous, that some medications don't mix with them at all, and that a good program's first job is sometimes to tell you no. The more I read, the more I understood that the people doing this well were as interested in who shouldn't take it as who should. That seriousness was exactly what gave the whole thing credibility, which led me more or less to the next question. Could psychedelics actually help me? So I looked into what was legally available where I live, in Florida. The answer was almost nothing. Ketamine was essentially the only psychedelic assisted treatment that I could pursue legally in Florida through private clinics. Everything else that interested me was either prohibited under federal law or locked away inside research settings. I looked briefly into whether I might join a university study. There were extraordinary institutions doing this work, but I learned quickly that getting in wasn't a matter of just raising your hand. The waiting lists were long, the eligibility narrow, and there was no guarantee of ever being chosen. So I kept learning. And while I did, something was quietly changing across the country. Oregon had become the first state to build an actual legal framework for supervised psilocybin services. Colorado had voted to follow and was beginning to construct its own. These weren't back rooms or underground circles, they were regulated systems, licensing requirements, facilitator training, safety protocols, legal oversight. For the first time, it looked genuinely possible for an ordinary person to do this openly, legally, and most of all, responsibly. And that reframed the whole subject for me. I stopped seeing psychedelics as a relic of the counterculture and started seeing them as what they actually were becoming, an evolving branch of mental health care, one built, this time, on decades of research rather than misconception. I wasn't chasing an altered state. I was chasing understanding. And the more I understood, the more this felt less like a leap and more like an informed step. If I approached it with humility, preparation, and respect, then maybe psychedelic therapy could be one more tool, not a replacement for therapy or meditation or the slow work of growing. Just one more way in the oldest question I had, the one about how the mind, the body, and consciousness itself all fit together. The great surprise, in the end, wasn't discovering psychedelics. It was discovering how much of what I thought I'd known about them had been incomplete. Caelum brought his disquiet to his masters, hoping to learn some new practice or insight he had not considered. But their counsel only recommended more meditation and less pride. This did not satisfy Caelum. In some cases, the temple archives kept what the order no longer taught, and so Caelum turned to them in hopes of learning from their silences. What he found within intrigued him. Citations that led nowhere, a treatise signed under council restrictions so old no one could say who had ordered it. He traced the missing thing by its edges until he found its name in the journal of a navigator 900 years dead. The Rite of the Open Vessel. Long before the Jedi raised their first temple, a people called the Ithari had kept vigil on Bengal, where a vergence in the Force ran so near the surface of things that a living being could wade into it like a river. The Ithari did not treat it as a wonder or a weapon. They treated it as medicine. A seeker spent a season in preparation under their keepers, learning to loosen the walls of the self without abandoning it, and the keepers stayed close enough through the descent, and for the season after, helping the pilgrim carry home whatever the virgins had shown them concerning their relationship to the Force. The Jedi had known the rite once. Caelum found masters who had written of it gratefully, in language he barely recognized from his own teachers. He found the other accounts too, and made himself read them with equal care. In an age of schism, some younger Jedi had come to Bengal unprepared, chasing visions within the Force, chasing spectacle, and some returned broken. Some did not return at all. The council of that era, grieving and afraid, had not distinguished the practice from its abuse. They forbade the whole of it, and the forbidding outlived every master who remembered why. Caelum studied the rite for months. He heeded warnings alongside testimonies of the healed, and he waited for his own interest to reveal itself as folly. It never did. The more completely he understood what the rite asked of a seeker, the less it resembled a whim, and the more it resembled a choice. He was not chasing an altered state. He wanted to understand his own mind, and his place within a force he found increasingly distant. The Ithari still kept the virgins far beyond the Republic's light. They turned away no one who came in humility, prepared, and with respect. His masters would call it recklessness, and he could not prove them wrong until he returned. But there had always been a name for Jedi who left the temples to follow the Force where it led: Wayseeker. And Caelum had spent his whole life hearing exile in that word. Standing over the navigator's journal, the word now appeared to him as a threshold. I can't tell you the exact moment that I decided that psychedelic therapy was right for me. It came on so gradually that it almost felt less like a decision I made and more like one that made itself. Of the two states where it was legal, Oregon kept rising to the top, the first to build a real framework for supervised psilocybin therapy. Colorado was moving in the same direction, but had not yet found its footing. So Oregon it was. But which clinic? I spent weeks on it, comparing programs, reading every review that I could, researching facilitators, and taking an honest inventory of whether I was even a good candidate for this. I talked it through with my primary care physician. I talked about it with my nurse practitioner managing my antidepressant. And I went back over my medical history from every angle I could think of. If there was a box to be checked, I checked it. And one program kept rising above the rest. Epic Healing in Eugene, Oregon wasn't only the first licensed psilocybin service center in the state, it had something harder to quantify. Something I picked up in every interview I watched, every review I read, every conversation I listened to. They weren't promising miracles. They were building a space where a person could safely come face to face with themselves. And then there was Oregon itself. I'd never set foot there, but almost every account of psychedelic therapy I'd come across included something that happened after the medicine had worn off. People walking out into forests, sitting beside rivers, seeing the natural world as if for the first time. Over and over, nature wasn't just a backdrop to the healing, it was part of the healing itself. And if I was going to do this, if I was going to place one of the most profound experiences of my life into the hands of strangers, I wanted every advantage I could give myself. I wanted to prepare carefully. I wanted to feel safe. And I wanted to come back into the world in a place of extraordinary beauty. Oregon was the right call. And if I held out until the weather turned, late spring, early summer, I'd arrive when the outdoors were at their very best. But that meant waiting several months. I decided it was worth the wait. So I booked the trip. And at the time, I thought I was preparing for a single day of therapy in Oregon. I had no idea that the deeper journey had already begun, or that this, right here, was where the story truly started.